Last spring, in a lakeside home in northern Michigan, a retired mechanical engineer noticed something subtle. The drywall inside his workshop closet felt slightly cool to the touch, even though the furnace had been running consistently. He removed a stack of storage bins and saw a faint charcoal discoloration tracing the seam where the exterior wall met the floor. Did not look dramatic, no heavy odor, no visible fuzz, just a thin, irregular shadow spreading behind a row of fishing gear and tool cases. He cut a small inspection opening between studs. The backside of the drywall revealed a mature fungal colony that had been developing quietly for at least a year. Condensation from winter temperature differentials had been collecting behind the vapor barrier. Each heating cycle fed the cycle. A local remediation company evaluated the damage. The proposal included containment barriers, negative air machines, antimicrobial fogging, removal of insulation, partial framing treatment, and reconstruction. Estimated cost just under $6,000. The surprising part is not the quote. Professional remediation has its place. The surprising part is that the surface phase of that growth could have been interrupted months earlier using two common household substances costing less than the price of a fast. But before discussing intervention, we need to establish what mold actually is at a structural level. Most homeowners misunderstand the problem from the start. What you see on a wall is not the mold. It is the reproductive structure of a fungal organism that has already colonized the substrate. Beneath that visible layer is a microscopic network of branching filaments called hyphae. These filaments penetrate cellulose, adhesives, wood fibers, and even dust accumulation. They form a mycelial network that behaves more like a root system than a stain. A single mature colony can release millions of airborne spores in a 24-hour period. These spores typically measure between 2 and 20 micrometers in diameter. For scale, a human hair averages around 70 micrometers. This means spores are small enough to remain suspended in indoor air currents, circulate through HVAC systems, settle on new surfaces far from the original site. They do not need dramatic flooding events. They require 3 variables: moisture, moderate temperature, and organic material. Modern building assemblies unintentionally provide all 3. Face drywall, engineered wood products, insulation cavities that trap condensation. Environmental health studies estimate that tens of millions of structures across North America contain measurable fungal growth at some point in their lifespan. Clinical literature has linked prolonged indoor exposure to increased rates of asthma development, allergic sensitization, chronic sinus inflammation, and in certain cases cognitive symptoms associated with mycotoxin exposure. This is not cosmetic decay. It is a systems failure in moisture management combined with biological opportunity. The engineer in Michigan did not have a catastrophic leak. He had a seasonal condensation pattern. That is far more common, and it is precisely why small-scale, early-stage management matters. Because when you understand the organism and you understand the environment it depends on, the intervention becomes less about panic and more about controlled chemistry applied at the right time. Long before polymer sealants and registered antimicrobial sprays were available, communities living in damp climates had already developed reliable fungal control practices based on observation rather than laboratory theory. In 18th century coastal Sweden, timber homes endured prolonged wet seasons with minimal insulation. Parish records and estate management logs describe seasonal wall washing using fermented grain vinegar. The practice was routine, not exceptional. It was performed at the end of winter, though when moisture intrusion was highest. Across the Atlantic in rural Nova Scotia, similar techniques appear in household manuals from the mid-1800s. Stone cellars and root storage rooms were wiped with sour cider solutions. After cleaning, fine alkaline ash from hearth fires was brushed lightly across wooden beams and left undisturbed. In the mountainous regions of northern Italy, wine vinegar was applied to aging plaster walls in food storage rooms. Lime-based alkaline washes were used to condition surfaces between seasons. These methods emerged independently in regions separated by language, culture, and trade. What unites them is not tradition. It is convergence. Acid was used to disrupt active growth. Alkalinity was used afterward to create an environment less hospitable to recurrence. They were not combined. They were staged. None of these communities described phase or membrane permeability. They simply observed patterns. Acidic solutions were applied and left undisturbed for sufficient time. Visible growth diminished more completely. Alkaline residues were maintained on surfaces. Regrowth slowed. This repeated pattern across centuries suggests something important. The mechanism is not modern. It is foundational chemistry interacting with fungal biology. The industrial era did not invent mold control, repackaged it. The reason this historical layer matters is not nostalgia. It demonstrates that effective fungal management does not require exotic chemistry. It requires understanding how acids and bases influence living cells and surface environments. To understand why this staged approach works, we need to examine fungal physiology with precision but without unnecessary abstraction. Mold cells are protected by a semi-permeable membrane and outer wall composed largely of chitin, glucans, and proteins. Their enzymatic machinery functions within a relatively narrow internal Phi range. When that internal balance is disrupted, stability declines rapidly. White distilled vinegar contains approximately 5% acetic acid. Acetic acid is a weak organic acid. Its molecular size and polarity allow it to diffuse through porous materials more effectively than many oxidizing disinfectants. Drywall paper, unfinished lumber, and grout, this diffusion matters. Undiluted vinegar is applied generously to a contaminated surface. Acetic acid molecules migrate through the extracellular matrix of the colony and into individual fungal cells. Inside, acetic acid dissociates, releasing hydrogen ions. This increases intracellular acidity. Cells attempt to buffer phase changes through active transport mechanisms. But when external acidity is sustained, mechanisms become overwhelmed. Enzymes denature, membrane gradients collapse, structural proteins destabilize. The colony loses metabolic viability. The critical factor is dwell time. Immediate scrubbing removes liquid before sufficient penetration occurs. Allowing a minimum of 1 hour of undisturbed contact increases the likelihood that acetic acid reaches embedded hyphae within porous substrates. After metabolic disruption, mechanical removal becomes essential. Even non-viable spores retain allergenic proteins. Scrubbing with warm water and physically removing residue reduces immunological triggers and prevents reactivation if moisture later returns. The second stage introduces a mild alkaline environment. Sodium bicarbonate dissolved lightly in water and applied to the clean surface shifts local pH toward approximately 8 to 9. 0.1 dry. Most common indoor molds favor slightly acidic to neutral conditions for optimal reproduction. Sustained alkalinity inhibits spore germination and hyphal extension. There is also a moisture dynamic. Sodium bicarbonate is mildly hygroscopic. A thin residual film can absorb small amounts of ambient moisture, surface water activity. Fungal spores require available water to initiate metabolic activity. Lower water availability decreases growth probability. This sequence acid disruption, mechanical removal, alkaline conditioning targets both active organisms and environmental recurrence variables. It is not dramatic chemistry. It is controlled manipulation of Phi and moisture interacting with biological constraints. To evaluate this approach honestly, it must be compared against what most homeowners reach for first. Retail mold products generally rely on one of 3 strategies: oxidation, membrane disruption through quaternary ammonium compounds, or encapsulation coatings. Chlorine-based oxidizers, such as sodium hypochlorite, are effective on non-porous surfaces. On glass, glazed tile, or sealed metal, they remain at the interface where the organism resides. Oxidation destroys surface cells and removes pigmentation, often producing rapid visual results. The limitation emerges on porous materials. Drywall, raw lumber, carpet backing, grout, and insulation allow moisture transport beneath the visible surface. Chlorine molecules are relatively reactive and tend to act quickly at the interface. Meanwhile, the carrier solution, predominantly water, can penetrate more deeply. The visible colony may bleach away. Embedded hyphae can remain structurally intact if the active oxidizer does not reach sufficient depth. The surface appears clean, yet regrowth occurs weeks later under the same moisture conditions. Quaternary ammonium disinfectants provide broader antimicrobial coverage and are widely used in institutional settings. They are typically formulated for surface sanitation rather than deep porous infiltration. Performance depends heavily on cleaning, dwell time, and reapplication frequency. Encapsulation coatings function differently. They seal contaminated surfaces under a polymer barrier, isolating spores from air exposure. This is effective in certain containment scenarios, but does not eliminate embedded biological material. By contrast, acids' smaller molecular profile allows more effective diffusion into porous substrates compared with larger oxidizing compounds. It does not rely on pigment oxidation for visible conformation. It alters intracellular conditions directly. When followed by alkaline conditioning, the sequence modifies both biological viability and surface chemistry. This does not imply that commercial products are universally inferior. It highlights that performance depends on context, substrate, porosity, contact time, and user protocol. Marketing simplifies, biology does not. To understand why this sequential method is rarely positioned as a primary retail solution, it helps to look at incentives rather than intentions. The residential mold mitigation market in North America represents billions of dollars annually. That includes inspection services, antimicrobial sprays, sealants, fogging systems, and reconstruction materials. Professional remediation in cases of structural saturation, intrusion, or large-scale contamination is justified. Containment and air filtration are necessary under those conditions. The economic layer becomes more interesting at the consumer shelf level. To sell a product labeled as a fungicide or disinfectant, manufacturers must register formulations under pesticide regulations. This requires standardized laboratory efficacy testing against defined organisms, toxicological review, stability validation, and compliance documentation. The process is expensive and time-consuming. From a business perspective, that investment only makes sense when the formulation offers defensible margin through patents, proprietary blends, brand differentiation. Generic substances such as acetic acid and sodium bicarbonate are commodities. They cannot be patented in their basic forms. A company investing millions in regulatory approval for a product based solely on them would face immediate price competition with grocery store equivalents. There is also a chemical constraint. Combining an acid and bicarbonate in a sealed container results in continuous carbon dioxide generation. Pressure buildup is inevitable. Stabilizing such a mixture would neutralize the reactive properties that make each component useful. The outcome is predictable. Retail markets favor specialized formulations with defensible pricing structures. Simple sequential chemistry that consumers can assemble independently does not align with high-margin product models. This does not require coordinated suppression. It is an incentive structure. Industries develop around complexity and defensibility. Simplicity rarely scales profitably. Any method that claims universal effectiveness should be viewed skeptically. The acid-alkaline sequence has defined boundaries, and clarity about those boundaries increases credibility rather than diminishing it. This approach is appropriate for small, localized surface contamination, typically under 10 square feet, where building materials remain structurally sound and the moisture source can be identified and corrected. Is not a substitute for professional remediation in cases involving saturated insulation, widespread wall cavity colonization, vac system contamination, or sewage intrusion. If drywall has lost structural integrity, if framing is softened, or if insulation is heavily colonized, removal is often the correct response. Biological growth embedded within inaccessible cavities cannot be reliably managed through surface treatment alone. Application variables also matter. Undiluted vinegar should be used with ventilation, as acetic acid vapor can irritate respiratory passages and eyes. Protective gloves and eye protection are reasonable precautions. Sodium bicarbonate residue may leave a light film on darker surfaces if applied excessively. Material compatibility must be considered. Natural stone surfaces, certain sealants, and specialty coatings may respond unpredictably to acidic exposure. Spot testing in an inconspicuous area is prudent. Most importantly, this protocol does not eliminate the need for moisture correction. Relative humidity above 60%, recurring condensation, or unresolved leaks will recreate favorable conditions for fungal growth regardless of surface chemistry. Effectiveness is not about intensity, it is about appropriate scope. Used within defined limits, the method is rational and biologically consistent. When mold becomes visible inside a home, the response is rarely analytical. Reactive. Discoloration triggers urgency because it signals contamination. In that state, people gravitate toward the product that appears most powerful, most specialized, and most technical. Packaging reinforces this instinct. Industrial typography, hazard icons, and promises of rapid elimination create a perception of authority. The stronger the sensory signal, the sharper the smell. The more dramatic the bleaching effect, the more effective the product feels. By contrast, vinegar and baking soda are psychologically categorized as mild because they are familiar. Familiarity lowers perceived potency. If a substance is used in cooking, it does not feel like a professional grade intervention, even when the underlying chemistry supports its function. There is also a bias toward visible reaction. When liquids bubble aggressively, the brain interprets that as active cleaning. However, visible fizz is often just gas release from neutralization reactions. Dramatic visual feedback does not always correlate with biological disruption. Understanding this bias shifts decision-making. Instead of asking which product feels strongest, the better question becomes which mechanism aligns with fungal biology and substrate properties. When decisions move from sensation to mechanism, outcomes improve. Mold control becomes less about theatrics and more about environmental alignment. Mold is not an isolated event. It is a signal generated by a building system. Elevated indoor humidity, insufficient ventilation, thermal bridging, poorly insulated exterior walls, minor plumbing leaks. Seasonal condensation cycles create the conditions that allow spores to transition from dormancy to growth. The most durable solution integrates chemical intervention with environmental correction. Monitoring indoor relative humidity with a hygrometer provides objective feedback. Maintaining levels between 40 and 50% significantly reduces the probability of spore germination. Exhaust fans in bathrooms and kitchens should operate long enough to remove residual moisture, not just during visible steam production. Addressing small air leaks around windows and exterior penetrations reduces cold surfaces where condensation forms. Improving airflow in closets and behind furniture prevents stagnant microclimates. These adjustments alter the ecosystem mold depends upon. In this context, the acid-alkaline sequence becomes a targeted correction within a broader moisture management strategy. It is not a standalone miracle, it is one component of systems thinking. When mold is interpreted as feedback rather than catastrophe, response becomes measured and proportional. The engineer in Michigan ultimately corrected the condensation pattern by improving insulation continuity and adding a small circulation fan within the closet cavity. The visible colony was treated early using sequential acetic acid application, mechanical removal, and alkaline conditioning. The total material cost was negligible compared with structural remediation. The lesson is not that professionals are unnecessary. Severe contamination demands specialized equipment and containment. The lesson is proportional response. Minor outbreaks do not always require industrial solutions. When you understand how Phe influences fungal metabolism, how porosity affects chemical penetration, and how moisture governs recurrence, decision-making becomes grounded in mechanism rather than marketing. Bottled distilled vinegar is a dilute acetic acid solution. Baking soda is sodium bicarbonate. Their effectiveness depends entirely on sequencing, dwell time, and environmental correction. Applied thoughtfully, this approach can interrupt early-stage growth, reduce allergenic residue, and create surface conditions less favorable to recurrence. Knowledge reduces dependency. Mechanism replaces assumption. If this framework clarified the biological and environmental logic behind mold management, it carefully within its limits and share it with someone facing a similar issue. Practical understanding spreads quietly, compounds over time.